This is the S2G podcast, where we share conversations that help us understand how to scale the food, agriculture, oceans, and energy transitions. I'm your host, Tanya Beckrisis. In this episode, Sanjeev, Krishnan, and Jessica Murphy discuss 4 ingredients that are key to driving change in complex sectors. As a reminder, this content is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, or be used to evaluate any investment or security, and is not directed at any investor or potential investor in any investment vehicle sponsored by S2G. Investing involves risk, including the risk of loss. Specific companies mentioned in this podcast are for educational purposes and should not be construed as an endorsement of any kind. Please note that S2G may maintain investments in some of the companies discussed on this podcast. For more important information, please see s2gventures.com/disclosures. In the last few episodes, we featured panels from this year's S2G Summit. In this episode, we thought we would dig into the framing behind the series of conversations and the connective thread that ties them all together. Sanjeev Krishnan, Managing Partner at S2G, and Jessica Murphy, Vice President of Community at S2G, discussed the 4 ingredients needed to shift the global economy to a more sustainable and resilient future, namely innovation and business model innovation, community and storytelling, engaging with industry incumbents, and changing capital markets. Jessica and Sanjeev unpack the thinking behind this 4-ingredient framework and reflect on some of the conversations from Summit that help illuminate the role these components will play in transitioning our target sectors. With more than half the world voting this year, we are in a time of global political uncertainty. We believe that it's more important than ever to stay grounded in the elements that will enable us to continue moving these sectors forward. Jessica and Sanjeev discuss why this transition is both similar to and unique from the previous ones, the role that each of these components play, and how they can come together to overcome barriers and generate industry-scale transformations. Lastly, they dig into how systems thinking can unite stakeholders and sectors to realize scalable solutions that account for second and third order impacts. Because at the end of the day, as Sanjeev puts it, there's really only one transition, with all these systems being so interconnected. Jessica and Sanjeev have been working together for almost as long as S2G has been around, and it's great to hear them discuss the foundation for our mission and day-to-day work.
Thanks so much for sitting down with us today, Sanjeev. This really was a notable year for S2G. It's hard to believe that we're celebrating our 10th anniversary as a team working together this month. It's been an incredible journey, and so much has changed over that time. I was wondering if you wanted to share some of the thinking behind S2G's evolution and how that was reflected at the summit this year.
I think in the last 4 or 5 years, 50% of what we do is still food and ag, and that was obviously our mainstay, and it continues to be. In this next 3 years, it will continue to be half of it. But I think through that, we've been able to go into adjacent areas, obviously oceans and energy. All 3 systems effectively are core to delivering 90% of the things we need every day to live: transportation, the built environment, power, food. And so I think that I'm excited to what we call at the seams. So what are the things that are common? Obviously, all 3 of these systems are commodity systems. They're low margin compared to SaaS or pharma. They're capital intensive. They're regulatory sensitive. They're operating in usually very oligopolistic or consolidated markets, and where innovation has historically not fully been colonized throughout the system, at least modern innovation, the material science, the physics, the biology, the chemistry, the computation. But all of them are starting to have that. And so I think we wanted to give people that story around these things are actually much more interrelated, and there's not 3 transitions, there's one transition. And the one transition, by the way, we've been doing it for 10,000 years. We're not doing it for the first time. And so the transition that we've been doing for 10,000 years is we've been taking primary energy, secondary energy, and going from useful energy to useful materials, whether that it's photosynthesis and the sunlight, or whether it's hydrocarbons, or whether it's whatever it is. And we've been taking that and turning it into calories, turning it into electrons, turning it into energy density, and they power our ocean economy, our food economy, our energy economy. And so I think that narrative of this transition's been occurring for 10,000 years not in the last few decades, is an important one because we've been here before, we've done it before.
But we are definitely working under some new constraints and complexities.
I think increasingly we are facing an age where the thermodynamic demand of 8 billion going to a 10 billion planet, of more calories needed, more transportation needed, more energy needed, versus the thermodynamic supply is going to be, I think, much more complicated. And then you layer on climate change, and suddenly this journey and transition from useful energy to useful materials is much more complex. And we need to take a systems view of it, number one. We often don't look at the second order and third order issues. And if you think about the transitions that are occurring, like digitalization's occurred, I would argue, for 40 years, perhaps even earlier, with the birth of Fairchild Semiconductor and the birth of high-speed fiber and telecom, and all of that hardware led to the smartphone and then led to the growth of the internet. But because we didn't take a fully systems view, we have issues around frictions. For example, rare earths and magnets, and where we get those from critical minerals, semiconductors, and a reliance on one particular country, and then the logistics of all that with ports and fragility. But at the same time, you have opportunities because all of those things led to this precipice of much more advanced computing, which we call, the buzzword of the moment, AI. And then it also will lead to, I think, other, ways that we can increasingly R&D and really democratize it to allow for new biology, new physics, new chemistries to come into calories and electrons. So I think that was a big point of financing the transition. Is like, we've done it for 10,000 years. It is complicated by 21st century circumstances.
But despite the added complexities, there are still many things we can learn from past transitions, one of which is that they are usually made up of 4 components.
One is innovation and business model innovation. And we went through some case studies from sail to steam and then the disruption that occurred that obviously disrupted American energy dynamics and global energy dynamics. The second is obviously incumbents and how important they play a role. They're the tanker ships, we fund the speedboats. And those tanker ships are super important. And we need to engage with them because they have the balance sheet, the operating expertise, the credibility, the people often to execute at scale. And that's been occurring for a long time too. Third is really storytelling and influencing consumers, citizens, and affecting how the demand signals can shift, whether it's the policy demand signals or how you vote for your pocketbook when you go to a grocery store or go to a car dealership or any plethora of consumer choices that really impact the overall economy and the overall sort of system of energy, food, and oceans. And then finally, I think we have historically had capital market shifts, right? The invention of the junk bond, I think, really led to the growth of telecom in America, casinos, others. Like without that innovation, I don't know if that capital intensive cycle would have been funded the same way or as quickly. So I think what we said was financing the transition is actually not about money fully or at all, potentially. It's really about these 4 things that occurred last 300 to 400 years. And then I think if you think about this as the 5th productivity wave we've had in the last 300 years, the first being railroads, the second being electricity, the third being oil and polymers, and the 4th being computing, is the 5th resource productivity. And that was really the call to action that we've been having as a firm is it has to be cheaper, faster, better, and it has to be productive use of capital. And that's the journey, but it's not just about capital, it's about all these other things and aligning them.
We designed the agenda around addressing these 4 components and bringing representative voices together. So let's get into some of these conversations. Let's begin by talking about the role of industry incumbents. At the summit, we had Mead Harris, who's the CEO of Dynamo Energy Hub, interview Sophia Mendelson, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer and Commercial Officer at SAP Sustainability. They spoke about past missteps in corporate sustainability efforts and the evolving dynamics of sustainability within corporate strategies. Then, during another panel on clean molecules, panelists spoke about the challenges with market formation and incentive structures. How do you think about corporate opportunity when it comes to synthesizing climate objectives into business models? And how can incentive structures better motivate these shifts?
I'm a big believer that first we have to listen to these incumbents in terms of what the actual pain points are that they have, and then how can you solve them with innovations, products, and services that actually improve their bottom line or give them a competitive edge or allow them a new market entry in a way that is credible and proven. And so a lot of our portfolio companies are that speedboat, petri dish of proving product X or service Y, or that, hey, this has product market fit and can scale. And then in your channel, in your brand, in your balance sheet, in your execution dynamics, you can actually scale this. So I think that partnership model is, I think, been critical with regard to proving the economic case of whatever corporate interests are. The second thing I think is that once it's proven, can it go to scale? Because I think so much of the transition today has not been at scale, I would argue. Someone in the incumbent world reminded me of something that is happening as a secular theme. There's not even a rounding error, there's a pre-rounding error. So prove to me this is, okay, I get that you can build a $100 million business, but $100 million businesses may be very attractive to our portfolio returns, assuming it's profitable. The incumbents may need $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion. So what are the secular themes that are going to move my shareholder value? And the third is, I think, building trust between a small growing company and then these large companies is not easy for both parties. And I think we've often had, because we have a really dedicated focus to this, and 4 people that are calling on corporates every day, and we all are calling on corporates, but 4 people dedicating to it, understanding their language and what builds trust and credibility with them. And then obviously working with our portfolio companies, existing and new, how to match and bridge trust so that it leads to real, genuine commercial partnerships that are a mutual benefit. So I think first is being super humble that these large corporates, trying to do the right thing by their shareholders, and they're under a system of constraints. And then also bridging to a different system of constraints, capital constraint, management constraint, time constraint that our portfolio companies are often in, and how do you build the two in terms of formation. The other thing that I've noticed, and that's been a lot of the siloness of these value chains, right? In energy, in food and agriculture, and oceans. And then as we've wanted to do scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, as consumers wanted to know where everything came from and understand it, they're saying, no, milk just doesn't come from a truck. I got to go all the way back, not just to the dairy, but to the feed that it comes into. And so I think that's been interesting as well in terms of the incumbents don't often talk to each other, let alone talk to emerging companies.
So what about the storytelling component? We had 2 great conversations. One with Kevin Kwan, author of the #1 New York Times best-selling Crazy Rich Asians trilogy, and John Panetti, film producer and president of Panetti Pictures. We spoke about what it took to bring the Crazy Rich Asians movie to the big screen. And then Caitlin Yarnell, Chief Storytelling Officer at the National Geographic Society, who shared some thoughts and stunning videos about why authentic stories matter. Where are you seeing storytelling play a critical role, and how do we think about combining these forces to tell bigger stories that influence greater societal shifts rather than focusing on just one company or one technology?
Yeah, I think fundamentally all 3 of these sectors are incredibly policy sensitive and hence citizen sensitive, I would argue. And we've had, I think, half the planet or more are going to be voting this year. And I'm very reminded of Andrew Breitbart said something super powerful on politics. And he said, politics is downstream from culture. And culture is where a lot of the changes occur, and then they infect the politics. I would argue, similarly in our business, the consumer and citizens are the canary in the coal mine ultimately, because either they vote with their dollar or they vote in the voting booth for certain policies or certain goods and services they want to buy. And tapping into what consumers and citizens want throughout history has been an important driver of economic value for companies. And I think core to that is storytelling. And how are you appealing both culturally, economically, politically to it? So I think ultimately the most powerful force in global capitalism, in my respect, is not shareholders or capital, it's consumers. And consumers will drive demand signals. And we're just starting with millennials and Gen Z being a more core part of the consumer economy globally and in the US. And that's, I think, one aspect of storytelling. The second aspect is the capital markets storytelling that I think is very important. Because ultimately, whether you're in the private capital markets or in the public capital markets, you have to have a narrative of your stock or your security, your business. And I think that your ability to do that well is important. Not everyone can be like Elon and storytell, or Jeff Bezos and storytell until earnings per share comes up and the cash flow. But those two people built huge businesses and defied the laws of capital markets, I would argue, because they told a story around what Amazon was going to be and what Tesla was going to be. You have to be credible, high integrity, but persuade capital markets to give you the license to go execute and form capital. And then the third is I would argue you have to storytell to your people. If talent is the most critical driver of success, what your company does, your ability to recruit and retain, particularly in a bear market. And so your ability to storytell, to keep and retain your best talent and kind of get through this drawdown that's occurring right now is very important. And I think it was great to have some of the storytellers we had. Crazy Rich Asians, the story of how that story even came to be is they were scrappy, they were brave, they did not compromise on their values.
Yeah, the conviction they had in knowing that their story was ready for mass market as opposed to niche consumption.
And they could have taken the easy route in terms of how they syndicated to Netflix or not. And then the woman from National Geographic was like the format of storytelling, like how visual that was. But I didn't realize like how much people retain visually versus non-visually, and then how to even tell that visual story. And it was super interesting.
So now let's talk about this capital markets piece. At Summit, you had a conversation with Jeff Ubben, founder and managing partner at Inclusive Capital Partners, to reflect on the role that investors play in sector transitions, particularly in the energy sector. When you think about investing with a long-term horizon and achieving a just transition in the energy sector, that's no low bar. So what are some of the levers to help achieve these goals from an investor perspective?
I love Jeff. And what he did at Value Act, I've always found so impressive. And his whole thing was not activism, but constructivism. So working with boards and management. And then bringing the right talent to bear. And then third was future-proofing your business. And then he took that skill set of future-proofing that he'd done across many companies to energy and climate. And I think he'd had some great successes, like AES, went from majority coal to majority renewable and a few other things.
Before Jeff founded Inclusive Capital Partners, he founded Value Act Capital, a hedge fund that invests in public equity markets. In 2018, Value Act bought a stake in AES Corp, which is an international power producer, and Jeff joined the board to push for cleaner energy resources. Today, AES has a goal of completely exiting from coal by 2027 and achieving net zero carbon emissions for the whole business by 2050.
But he also talked about the difficulties of it. And his whole thing was there was a generation of capital markets where it was management supremacy, which led to some potentially misallocation of capital for shareholders. And he was almost saying we may have overcorrected to shareholder supremacy. It was all about shareholder value and shareholder maximization. And I think the challenge was, are we going to ever see a system of stakeholder, not supremacy, but inclusion in that? And I think that's been the debate the last 3 or 4 years is how do you balance the tensions of shareholder supremacy with stakeholder resiliency and continuity, frankly. And ultimately, if this produces greater returns with lower volatility, I believe the next 40 years are not going to be like the last 40 years. We're going to go from the great moderation to the great volatility. And the next 40 years, you're going to have questions around the future of globalization, the future of demographics and the aging of most of the world, issues around the natural rate of economic growth and inflation, given the debt deficits that we've racked up the last 20 or 30 years, which have been unsustainable and massive. And it's not just about maximizing shareholder value. I think how do you lower volatility? And I think Jeff talked to that a lot in the capital markets. And I think a lot of the companies we back and we hope to back are trying to make those systems, the food system, the energy system, less volatile relative to the last 40 years. And I think we need that en masse. And I think that's where I would bring in
your last ingredient right here. It's the innovation and business model innovation.
Yeah. But I think they need to de-risk systems, whether it's weed management in precision agriculture or it's more decentralized microgrids or companies that are able to help make the grid more bidirectional, or shipping companies that are dealing with a ton of volatility, weather volatility, rebels shooting at them and having to do new routes. I think this is the role of good physics, good biology, good chemistry, good computation, married with good business models with real products and services for the 21st century. And the big idea that we're not there yet, but can this all be deflationary? Because I think everyone now thinks it's structurally inflationary. This global de-risking, because all these things that we took for granted the last 40 years are really getting challenged, particularly I think since COVID, but even before then.
So going back, if these are the ingredients for the transition, then they can't just stand alone. They have to work together. So where do you see this happening? And we've spent a lot of the conversation actually naturally. You've gone from one ingredient to the other, and I think it carves it out pretty nicely. But what can we do to encourage more interplay between these ingredients?
One, first gather them, because they often, energy transition is just energy. Actually, no, it involves calorie production or shipping, or food is just consumers. No, it involves the cost of urea, which is the cost of hydrogen and natural gas. So this actually are much more interrelated, and you need to underwrite the whole system if you want to exploit your competitive advantage. I think that's important. Two is, I think, create business models that involve that. So one of our platforms that we're building is looking at offtake from petrochem and fertilizer companies using renewables, electrolyzers to, create that offtake. That's an example where they're going to touch and be impacted for their underwriting case in every industry. So there's a bunch of companies that have tremendous at the seams leverage. The third is storytelling of the case studies. I think over the weekend I sent this in our Slack group, but I still remember when lab-grown diamonds came out, it was seen as very niche. And then I read in the FT that De Beers may have trouble getting sold. And that was a combination of the four ingredients, in my opinion. There was like some fundamental innovation around the lab-grown diamonds getting close to mined diamonds. But then it took storytelling. And I still remember walking out of, I think, Leonardo DiCaprio's Blood Diamonds. And I think it was my girlfriend, not my wife. I think it turned her off. It turned her off. And then the growth of the consumers then started behaving differently from that innovation and storytelling. And then they led to some scale businesses and market share gains for lab grown. And then now the capital markets have been you may have difficulty selling this thing because of a secular trend that's occurring. And I think that's just one sort of niche example, but that could happen in seafood. That could happen in regenerative agriculture. That could happen in parts of the energy segment, whether it's demand response at home or the electrification of transportation. I know there's been a lot of, anxiety or concern around the future of EVs, but last year, 10% of new cars sold were EVs. And I think they're going to get cheaper and they're going to get better, and they're already pretty fast. But
cheaper and better.
And they're already fast. But I think you're seeing these four ingredients play out constantly in all transitions in every part of our economy. But I think in the things we work on every day, they're going to be more relevant.
Sanjeev, you've been a systems thinker probably your whole life, but at least as long as I've known you, and like a lot of the work even before S2G was around systems thinking, systems investing. How do you see the post-COVID is probably a good mark as we start to think about timing? Is that accelerating? How are you thinking about systems investing right now?
So I think of like systems investing and systems thinking is like the art and science of second and third order dynamics, and they impact the first order thing that you work on. You're going at a macro level from moderation to volatility, particularly since COVID. In that volatility, you have to build businesses that are less volatile and productive at the same time. So how do you build a business where you have a product that has a 1-year payback period to the person buying your product? So that's hopefully productive. But you also are able to lower emissions by X% and help with scope 2 and scope 3 emissions. And the supply chain is more distributed. So you're not have single source of failure for that supply chain. We have a company in our portfolio like that in the middle of the country. So there's so many stories in our portfolio and in other people's portfolios of these small emerging companies. That one was ORNDV. But there are so many other companies in our portfolio that are trying to de-risk the system with more distributed production systems, or more decentralized, or more de-risked. And they're trying to play into this volatility. And instead of, oh my God, urea could go from 30 cents a pound to $1.20 a pound. Actually, if urea goes from 30 cents a pound to $1.20 a pound because Russia invaded Ukraine, actually my product and service is more relevant to the farmer. I can help them keep or increase their yield and improve their soil health. So when they want to sell the farmland, it's better off. And it sequesters essentially some carbon. So it's like we're living in a period of volatility. I think it's the best time to be an entrepreneur or in a small emerging company, assuming you can solve your capital market issue and you can execute well, which are two big assumptions that I think are very difficult right now. I think there's no escaping some laws of gravity. If your business is based on a semiconductor and China invades Taiwan in the next 3 to 5 years, you're going to be in a spot of trouble. But that's why we have a portfolio. And we have different risks that each company brings into the portfolio and different reward that each brings into the portfolio. But I think leadership and product development and product distribution and business model innovation in the 21st century has to involve these macro forces that I think are inherently more volatile and will continue to be more volatile in the next 30 years. And so Chuck would say, giddy up, because it's a new generation of companies that have to manage through this volatility.
Yeah, giddy up. And obviously an investor is our first and foremost role, but we have a platform and we support a lot of other efforts. What gives you the most hope as you look ahead for S2G's role as a convener and continuing to build and bring together this community?
Fundamentally, it's the entrepreneurs, the management teams are bringing actual products and services, and increasingly we're investing later and later as they're increasingly proven in the marketplace. And our role is to help scale them with customer introductions, policy introductions, capital market introductions, influencer introductions that hopefully increases probability of success. And that gives me a lot of hope that I don't think that this transition needs to be as structurally inflationary as I think every economist believes it to be. Because I do think there'll be market signals that create more innovation into those areas and more entrepreneurs that go into that and say, hey, let's rethink these potentially false choices. Two, since day one, it's been around the consumer as a secular change, millennials and Gen Z. And I think those two cohorts, I would argue, have the highest discount rate about their future because they're young and they want to live for a while, I assume. And so they are much more focused on long-term dynamics. These issues that we work on are both urgent and important to that cohort. And that gives me a lot of hope they will press for change. And then third, I think, to be honest with you, Jeff said this, it's not climate finance, just finance. It's not renewable energy, just energy. And so the mainstreaming of this stuff will take away some of the prefixes we now attach. And as that stuff gets more scale, it's going to be like, oh, this is just a mainstream thing that I have to do. I think we're like 10 to 20 years from that world, but I think the direction of travel so far is towards that path.
I hope closer to 10 than 20.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what did I not ask you that we should cover?
I think one thing that I am increasingly excited about or wanting to do is really this fit for purpose capital market system that we need to execute on these transitions. I think if we're jerry-rigging existing asset classes, existing in benchmarking, existing indices, existing products into farmland, into shipping, into like advanced manufacturing, I worry that's going to be very high friction, high transaction costs and take a long time. And so I think this whole engagement with asset owners and the actual people doing the work at the 5 feet level and figuring out the right capital formation or the right situation and sector and that provides good returns and puts us to less volatility, greater visibility of impact, and creates real value for shareholders. I think that's the next journey.
I think we're working on that as we look ahead, where we spend more time. Thanks, Sanjeev. It's been fun to talk to you about it, and looking forward to 2025 already and all the things in the hopper for 2024.
As Sanjeev and Jessica emphasized, we're always looking for more opportunities to grow our ecosystem and encourage conversation between stakeholders and sectors as we work to bring together these 4 ingredients. We look forward to creating and participating in more of these spaces and to share any takeaways with you. Thank you for tuning in to the S2G podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review, or share it with a friend. For more information or to connect with us, check out s2gventures.com.